We hear all the time that justice delayed is justice denied, but like what actually happens when the organization you think is supposed to protect your rights ends up being the obstacle to justice?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question.
And that's really the question that's raised in this report we're looking at today. State police officers, a decade of injustice and mismanagement. And it looks at the experience of state police officers in Trinidad and Tobago who were let go by RBC-RBTT Bank.
Right.
And it looks at how the State Police Association, a.k.a. the EPA, and specifically the representatives Harrison Thompson and Clay Hackett, might have actually made the injustice even worse.
Yeah, you know what's really compelling about this report is that it only uses publicly available documents. So like verbatim court notes, affidavits, emails, that kind of thing.
Oh, wow.
So it's not really speculating. It's really focusing on the actions of the EPA and its representatives, like what they actually did. And what comes out of this is this picture of procedural missteps and a lack of transparency that really raises concerns about how the EPA represented these officers.
So it's not just like the wheels of justice turning slowly, but there are maybe some like systemic issues within the EPA itself.
Yep, definitely could be.
So let's start with the legal journey of these officers.
Okay.
They were initially dismissed because of redundancy, which is a valid reason.
Right.
But the report is saying that the EPA mishandled their case from the very beginning, which led to this huge legal battle that went through multiple courts, like the Industrial Court, the High Court, the Court of Appeal, and even the Privy Council.
Yeah, it's really important to understand that this isn't just a story about like bureaucracy. It's really about how specific actions or inactions by EPA representatives may have like directly messed up the officer's chances of a fair hearing.
Right.
And the report really focuses in on two main guys, Harrison Thompson, who was the first one to handle the case, and then Clay Hackett, who got involved later in the legal stuff.
Okay, so let's break down what they did and look at what the report is claiming.
Sounds good.
So starting with Harrison Thompson, the report says he made a big mistake right away. Instead of classifying the officer's case as wrongful dismissal due to redundancy, he registered it at the Ministry of Labor as just retrenchment. That sounds like a technicality to me, but I'm guessing it had serious consequences.
Absolutely. It basically weakened the officer's legal standing right from the start. So you can imagine like building a house on a foundation that's not stable. The whole structure is compromised.
Yeah.
And in the same way, this little error in how they categorized the case might have set them up for a decade of legal problems. And the report actually points to the official court records showing the Ministry of Labor registration date as May 16, 2014. And it's under that wrong classification. And what's even crazier is there's nothing in the court documents later or in the EPA meeting transcripts that shows they ever fixed this mistake.
Wow, that's a huge oversight.
Yeah.
And the report goes on to say more. It talks about Thompson's alleged negotiations with RBC on behalf of the officers.
Right.
And here's the interesting thing. Thompson says he negotiated a settlement, but there's like zero documentation to back that up. And there's no evidence that the officers got anything good out of these supposed negotiations.
Yeah, the lack of transparency is really troubling. And there's this recorded meeting transcript where Thompson's like, I have a letter authorizing me to move the matter. All confident. But then the special tribunal chairman specifically told the EPA to go back to the bank and negotiate. And there's no record of Thompson actually doing that at all.
So what was negotiated?
Yeah.
Were the officers even told, and why isn't there any paper trail?
It's a good question, and it feels like the officers were left completely in the dark while their representative was making decisions that directly affected their future.
Right. And this lack of communication seems to be something that keeps happening in the report.
Yeah, it's not just about potential missteps. It's about the lack of clear and consistent communication between the EPA representatives and the people they were supposed to be fighting for.
Okay, so we've got this questionable case categorization and these undocumented negotiations not exactly looking good for Thompson's representation.
Right.
So let's move on to Clay Hackett. What was he doing in all of this?
Okay, so Hackett's role is all about this important legal document called an affidavit, which is basically a sworn statement that you use as evidence in court.
Right.
And the report says that Hackett filed an affidavit that had exhibits, the supporting evidence, but later he admitted that he didn't even have access to the official verbatim notes from the proceedings when he filed it.
Hold on, how can you submit evidence if you haven't even looked at the official record of what happened? That seems like a rookie mistake, especially for someone representing the EPA.
You're right to question that. It definitely makes you wonder about how accurate and reliable the information in the affidavit is.
Right.
And to make things even worse, even after he got the verbatim notes, Hackett didn't bother to change the affidavit.
Wow, so they let potentially inaccurate information just stand, and these officers were basically screwed because of it. That seems so unfair.
You got to remember that a judicial review process really depends on affidavits to decide if a case is valid.
Right.
And if the affidavit has mistakes or leaves out important stuff, it can totally mess up the whole review process. So in this case, the officers might have been denied a fair hearing, all because of an oversight by their own representative.
This is starting to feel like a whole bunch of errors piled up on top of each other.
Yeah.
What seemed like a simple redundancy case at first has turned into this confusing mess of procedural mistakes and a lack of transparency.
Right.
And the ones suffering the most are these officers who've been waiting for a decade for a fair resolution.
That's the really sad part of all this. These aren't just legal concepts. We're talking about real people whose lives have been put on hold while they're trying to navigate a system that seems to be working against them.
It's frustrating, to say the least, and it makes you wonder if this is happening. In this case, how many other situations like this are out there?
That's a question we definitely need to think about. This case could be just the tip of the iceberg, showing a much bigger problem within organizations that are supposed to be protecting workers' rights. But before we get into that, let's look at what the EPA's role was in all this.
Okay.
So it's almost like...
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It's almost like the EPA, instead of helping these officers, became the problem they had to overcome.
Yeah, it's like instead of being the shield, they became the obstacle.
Exactly. And unfortunately, the report seems to agree with that idea.
Yeah.
So after the Privy Council basically said there are wiggle mistakes and sent the case back to the beginning, you'd think the EPA would want to fix things right to make sure these officers finally get a fair hearing.
Yeah, that makes sense. A chance to right the wrong, so to speak. But the report shows this frustrating pattern of delays and inaction when the officers ask for new legal representation.
Exactly. The report has all these emails and letters going back to 2024, clearly asking for permission for a new lawyer to take over the case.
Okay.
But the EPA's responses, if you can even call them that, are just full of bureaucratic jargon, and there's no sense of urgency at all.
It's like they're dragging their feet on purpose. The report even mentions some things the EPA secretary said during meetings that downplay the need for quick action. Almost dismissive, you know?
Yeah, you could see it that way. Another way to look at it, maybe a little nicer, is that they're just overwhelmed or stuck in their own internal processes.
Right.
But no matter the reason, the effect is clear. More delays for these officers who are already facing a rehearing that's scheduled for April 2025.
Oh, wow.
And without good legal representation that happens on time, they risk making the same mistakes again, which means more delays, more appeals, more years wasted in this legal mess.
This is like the definition of justice delayed is justice denied. They need a new lawyer to avoid making the same mistakes again, but they're stuck waiting for permission from the very organization that let those mistakes happen in the first place.
It's a frustrating situation for sure, and it raises the question, is the EPA actually doing what's best for these officers?
Yeah.
Or are they putting their own internal politics and procedures ahead of the needs of the people they're supposed to represent?
It's hard to say they're doing what's best for the officers based on what we've seen so far.
Right.
Is there anything in the report that explains why the EPA might be pushing back on a request for new legal representation?
The report itself doesn't try to guess why they're doing it. It just sticks to the facts and presents the documented evidence of procedural errors and that lack of transparency. Remember, its purpose is to raise public awareness and encourage people to look closely at the legal process. It's not trying to blame anyone or attack anyone personally.
I get it. It's frustrating. But I understand why they need to be objective. But the question is still there. If it's not intentional malice, then what is causing these actions or inactions? Is it just incompetence or bureaucratic inertia?
It's tough to say for sure without looking into it further, but the report does mention a possible disconnect between the EPA leadership and the regular officers.
Okay.
There's this sense that the leadership might be putting their own interests first, maybe because they're worried about admitting they were wrong or facing some kind of legal trouble.
That brings up an important point about accountability.
Yeah. If an organization like the EPA, which has so much power over people's careers and livelihoods, is allowed to operate without being checked and without being accountable, then what does that say about the systems we have to protect workers' rights?
It definitely suggests that we need more transparency and stronger ways to hold these organizations accountable. And the report, by shining a light on this case, is a step in the right direction.
let's shift gears for a second and talk about the report itself.
Sure.
It's been the basis for our whole discussion today. So can you talk a bit about how they put it together and what sources they used? How did the author gather all this information and present these findings?
Well, the report's strength is that it relies on primary sources, so it's not using hearsay or anonymous stories. It very carefully cites official documents like court transcripts, affidavits, letters, emails, even the Privy Council ruling.
Wow.
This commitment to documented evidence really makes his findings more believable.
That's crucial for a report like this, especially with such sensitive allegations. By sticking to the facts, it avoids any accusations of bias or personal agendas. Exactly. It's about presenting a clear and unbiased account of what happened and letting the reader decide what they think.
So we have this group of officers wrongly dismissed, fighting for their rights for over a decade, represented by an organization that seemingly failed them at every step.
Right.
So where does this leave them now?
Yeah.
What can they do moving forward?
The most pressing issue is the upcoming rehearing.
Right.
The report stresses that without effective legal representation, these officers could face the same procedural hurdles and potentially even more delays. It's a race against time to find a competent lawyer and make sure their case is presented fairly and accurately.
It's like David and Goliath, with these officers up against not only a powerful institution like the bank, but also, in a way, their own representation.
Yeah.
It's hard not to feel angry on their behalf.
Their story shows the real human cost of bureaucratic inefficiency and lack of accountability.
Right.
It reminds us that behind every legal case, behind every procedural error, there are people whose lives are being directly affected.
That's a sobering thought. What can we as listeners learn from this? What's the takeaway message here?
I think the most important thing to remember is this justice delayed isn't just some abstract concept.
Yeah.
It has a real human cost. And while we can't change the past, we can use this case to make things better in the future.
How so? What can our listeners actually do?
The report has a few ideas. It encourages readers to dig deeper into the publicly available documentation, learn more about their rights, and support organizations that fight for workers' justice.
It also talks about the importance of holding elected officials accountable for making sure the legal system is fair and accessible.
That's right after all these systems are supposed to work for the people, not the other way around.
Absolutely. We need to be watchful, speak out against injustice whenever we see it, and demand transparency from those who are supposed to be protecting our rights. This case, while specific to a group of state police officers in Trinidad and Tobago, serves as a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is ongoing and it requires all of us to work together.
It's a reminder that we can't just sit back and do nothing, that silence means we're part of the problem, and that each of us has a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave our listeners with a final thought.
Okay.
If documented procedural errors can lead to a decade-long delay in justice for these officers, what does that say about the systems we have in place to protect workers' rights all over the world?
That's a question that deserves some serious thought, and it's a question that each of us has to answer through what we do, the choices we make, and our unwavering commitment to justice for everyone.
So it seems like the EPA, instead of being the shield for these officers, actually became an obstacle they had to overcome.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. And unfortunately, that's what the report seems to show, too. So after the Privy Council said, hey, there were some legal missteps here and sent the case back to square one, you'd think the EPA would be all over fixing the situation, right?
Yeah.
Making sure these officers finally got a fair hearing.
That would make sense, giving them a chance to right the wrongs.
Right, exactly. But the report shows this really frustrating pattern of the EPA delaying things and not taking action when the officers asked for new legal representation. The report actually points to emails and letters from as far back as 2024 clearly asking for a new lawyer to take on the case.
Okay.
But the EPA's responses, if you can even call them that, are full of bureaucratic jargon, and there's absolutely no sense of urgency in them at all.
It's like they're dragging their feet on purpose.
Yeah.
Almost dismissive, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I can see that you could interpret it that way. I guess another way to look at it, maybe a little more generously, is that they're just swamped or stuck in their own internal processes. But regardless of the reason, the outcome is the same. More delays for these officers who are already scheduled for another hearing in April 2025.
Oh, wow.
And without good legal representation that happens in a timely manner, they're risking making the same mistakes all over again, which means more delays, more appeals, more years wasted in this legal mess.
So this is like a textbook example of justice delayed is justice denied. They need a new lawyer to avoid repeating those past errors, but they're stuck waiting for permission from the organization that allowed those errors to happen in the first place.
It's a catch-22 and a very frustrating one for sure.
Hmm.
It really begs the question, is the EPA truly acting in the best interests of these officers?
Yeah.
Or are they putting their own internal politics and procedures above the needs of the people they're supposed to be representing?
Based on what we've seen so far, it's hard to argue that they're putting the officers' interests first. Is there anything in the report that explains why the EPA might be resisting the request for new legal representation?
The report itself doesn't really speculate on motives. It sticks to the facts, presenting the documented evidence of procedural errors and that lack of transparency. You have to remember, its stated purpose is to raise public awareness and encourage people to really examine the legal process. It's not about assigning blame or attacking individuals.
It's frustrating. But I do see the need for objectivity, but it still leaves the question. If it's not deliberate malice, then what is driving this lack of action? Is it just incompetence, or is it bureaucratic inertia?
It's tough to say definitively without a deeper investigation, but the report does suggest that there might be a disconnect between the EPA leadership and the regular officers.
Okay.
It seems like the leadership might be prioritizing their own interests. Maybe they're worried about admitting they were wrong or potentially facing legal trouble themselves.
That's a good point about accountability.
Right.
If an organization like the EPA, which has such a huge impact on people's careers and livelihoods, is allowed to operate without any oversight or accountability, then what does that say about the systems we have in place to protect workers' rights?
It definitely highlights a need for more transparency and better ways to hold these organizations accountable. And, this report, by bringing attention to this specific case, is a good step in that direction.
Let's change gears for a bit and talk about the report itself. It's been the foundation for our entire discussion today. So could you talk a little about its methodology and the sources they use? How did the author gather all this information and present these findings?
Well, the strength of this report is that it relies on primary sources. It doesn't depend on rumors or anonymous testimonies.
Right.
Instead, it meticulously cites official documents like court transcripts, affidavits, letters, emails, and even the Privy Council ruling.
Wow.
This dedication to using documented evidence makes its findings a lot more credible.
That's so important for a report like this, especially given the sensitive nature of the allegations. By sticking to the facts, it steers clear of any accusations of bias or hidden agendas.
Exactly. It's not about trying to create sensationalism. It's about presenting a clear and objective account of what happened so the reader can draw their own conclusions.
So we have this group of officers wrongfully dismissed who've been fighting for their rights for over a decade, represented by an organization that, it seems, failed them at every turn. Where does this leave them? Now, what are their options moving forward?
The most immediate concern is the rehearing that's coming up.
Right.
The report makes it very clear that without effective legal representation, these officers are at risk of facing the same procedural roadblocks and potentially even more delays. It's a race against time to find a competent lawyer and ensure their case is presented fairly and accurately.
It feels like a classic David versus Goliath situation, with these officers facing not only a powerful institution like the bank, but also, in a sense, their own representation.
It is.
It's hard not to feel outraged on their behalf.
Their story really highlights the human cost of bureaucratic inefficiency and lack of accountability.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that behind every legal case, behind every procedural error, there are real people whose lives are being directly impacted.
That's a sobering thought. What can we as listeners take away from this? What's the main message here?
I think the most important takeaway is that justice delayed isn't just some abstract concept. It has a very real and very human cost. And while we can't change what's already happened, we can use this case as motivation to make things better in the future.
How can we do that? What actions can our listeners take?
The report offers some suggestions. It encourages readers to dig deeper into the publicly available documentation, educate themselves about their rights, and support organizations that fight for worker justice.
It also stresses how important it is to hold elected officials accountable for ensuring we have a fair and accessible legal system.
Exactly. After all, these systems are supposed to work for us, not the other way around.
Couldn't agree more. We need to be vigilant, speak out against injustice whenever we see it, and demand transparency from those who are responsible for protecting our rights.
I agree completely.
It feels like we've just scratched the surface of something much bigger.
This report, while focused on a specific case in Trinidad and Tobago, really raises these universal questions about power, accountability, and access to justice. You're absolutely right. The things we've talked about today go way beyond just this one case. It makes you wonder how many other people in different industries and countries are going through similar struggles against bureaucracy and obstacles in the legal system.
It's a pretty heavy thought, and it makes you realize that we need to take a closer look at organizations like the EPA, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but all over the world. These organizations that are supposed to protect workers' rights, but maybe because of negligence or even self-interest, they become part of the problem.
Exactly, and that's why this report is so crucial. It's like a call for transparency, a demand for accountability, and a reminder that delaying justice can often mean denying justice altogether.
The report itself is really well researched.
Yeah.
It relies on solid documents and doesn't get into speculation, but it still leaves you with this feeling of unease, like this might just be one example of a much bigger systemic problem.
That feeling is totally valid, and it should make us ask tough questions, demand better from those in power, and hold organizations responsible for what they do.
So where do we go from here? What can our listeners do to actually make a difference?
The report offers a few suggestions. It encourages people to dig deeper into the publicly available documents, to learn more about their rights, and support groups that advocate for worker justice.
It also talks about holding elected officials accountable for making sure we have a legal system that's fair and accessible.
Right, because ultimately these systems should be working for the people, not the other way around.
Absolutely. We need to be aware of that, speak out against injustice whenever we see it, and demand transparency from those who are supposed to be protecting our rights.
Couldn't agree more.
This case, while specific to those state police officers in Trinidad and Tobago, shows us that the fight for justice is never over, and it requires everyone to join in.
Yeah. It's a reminder that we can't just sit back and do nothing, that staying silent makes us complicit, and that each of us has a part to play in making the world a more just and equitable place.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave our listeners with one final thought. If proven procedural errors can result in a decade-long delay in justice for these officers, what does that tell us about the systems we have in place to protect workers' rights around the world?
That's a powerful question, and one that deserves serious reflection. It's a question that each of us needs to answer through our actions, our choices, and our unwavering commitment to justice for all.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
An administrative role in informing me.
And that's all.
You see, as it relates to any other thing, they relinquished that by letter long time ago.
In our possession.
We have the letter. So, we beaten up ourselves too much, man.
Could we remind them of the relinquishment of that letter?
But we have a letter there. They're supposed to have it.
Seeing that he wasn't at the helm at that time.
Boy, that letter is the letter of the association.
Yeah, but what I'm saying now, could we remind them that?
But
leave
they're
the
free
matter
to
with
get remind, but the letter's supposed to be there.
because he
It's them letter, you know.
he looking for publicity and fame right now.
Hello. Hey,
Yeah.
you get that already tenfold.
Never mentioned.
When the fucking judgment come out, this come out, you didn't see big full fucking ad on the Sunday papers and Saturday papers. You get that free.
Who do the ad fame? Who do the ad fame?
You understand what
All you understand how it goes. So let me sure get all the comrades together again.
I just say
United
one
we stand.
people beating up this.
Yes, united we
No,
stand.
we
You
never fall
beat up
apart.
on this.
Huh?
We never fall apart.
No,
Everybody
no,
is busy.
no, no, no.
Everybody do one thing.
One man get trouble. Everybody was standing together.
Who is that?
Only one man get trouble. Get in Nobody else.
You're not here, why?
Nobody get
You're
trouble.
not
But
here.
everybody
Knowledge
has
is power.
stand one. All the
Knowledge
time.
is power.
Why is the man
And again, knowledge now.
But you
Knowledge
see,
is power.
Sandy, I find a point in
You see 14,
I find so.
right? So Sandy is trying to bring back all these, the 14 we said over to 15 fold, and let everybody stand together again.
And he's still a
Comrades.
brother.
Always.
You try to get 15 men here to look at
Always.
us. Yeah? See, man, powerful speech this morning. Yeah? Mr. Thompson, thank you, sir.
You understand? This is the
I'm
process
telling
of
us
the
15
situation.
minutes.
This matter, this still become